Okay, so I'm going to talk more about another aspect of open source that people don't talk much about, which is the business of open source. And I have to touch on the funding, and for that I have to touch on the governance as well. So I'll also try to be brief because I think Rachel or somebody said that the questions are more interesting than the presentation itself. So I'm going to try to condense it a little bit and have more time for questions and answers, hopefully. So open source is actually an economic activity. And there were a few questions actually today about how do we make corporations more responsible. Sean talked about the profit, so it's easy to condense my speech because he did half of it actually. So you really have to be sustainable in your development of your open source project. And like every company, like every startup, like everything, it's bound to the laws of economics, like demand and supply, diminishing marginal returns, the prisoner's dilemma. Somebody asked me what that means, and if you're curious, we can talk about that later. And one interesting thing about open source as opposed to commercial software is that what makes it successful is very different than the commercial world. In the commercial world, you have salespeople or whatever that go sell to other organizations or government and whatnot. And if the manager says that your project, what you did is good, then it's good. It sells. In open source, it's different because you have to really work hard to create something of quality that people adopt. Without adoption, you die. Right? So adoption is what makes open source successful, and that should be actually a goal, because that's how your project grows, that's how it becomes viable. And as an example, I put this graph about the history of adoption of databases, but you can find a lot of stuff about pretty much everything that can be compared against commercial software like browsers, internet frameworks, pretty much anything. But these are databases. And what's interesting to see here is that while we see the two lead providers of databases, Microsoft and Oracle, hanging in, pretty much everything else that comes out is open source now, right? From SQL and NoSQL sort of databases. Open source, to become viable, as I said, it has to be a long-term commitment. I think somebody said today that to be successful overnight, it still takes maybe 20 years of effort. And again, this is similar to what you see in the industry, including companies, startups. It's bound to this hype curve, if you want, where you have your initial trigger, the peak of expectations, then the disappointment, then the slope of enlightenment, and then the plateau of productivity. So pretty much every project follows this cycle. And it's not just the project, but the field in which the project operates. People talked about IoT today, databases and others. And one other important thing is that besides this long-term commitment, what you also need for your project to thrive are resources, meaning time, money, and skills. And I put this picture here. By the way, I think Tom said earlier that a picture is worth 1,000 words. We have a few tens of thousands of words here in this presentation, so it's a very, very condensed one. So this image about manufacturing processes is interesting because software development processes are very often associated or compared to manufacturing pipelines, right? So we have all sorts of metaphors in the software industry related to packaging and so forth. People, I think, mentioned that with Jenkins earlier today as well. And to manage all these resources, to have this long-term commitment for the project, what you have to have is good governance. And I'm going to talk more about governance in the coming minutes, but basically you have two choices. You either choose to have a collaborative model to build your project, or you want to have a model in which you're the benevolent dictator for life, in which you make the rules. So the question is, who makes decisions related to your project? In the collaborative model, there are many ways to build communities, and that led to quite a few foundations, the Apache Software Foundation being one. I know more of, I know about the others a little bit as well. Obviously the Linux Foundation, Mozilla, Eclipse. There are many other foundations, smaller foundations that usually copy an operation model of a larger foundation. Of course, there are universities, and there are also collaborative projects under the umbrella of another larger foundation. I mentioned ODPI there, the Open Data Platform Initiative, which is one of the collaborative projects of the Linux Foundation. I'm going to talk more about that. If you choose to go with the benevolent dictator model, and by the way, there is no right or wrong. Like everything in life, you have to make choices, right? You take the red pill or the blue pill, right? So here, you have to decide if you want to do it to be a dictator for the project and govern it as a person or small circle of individuals, or as a commercial entity. The individual person or group, I mentioned the two guys in the garage, which is a very common meme, I think. By the way, it doesn't have to be the same garage. These guys were not in the same garage, actually. But anyway, and commercial entities, there are many, many companies that decided to have their own open source project, but they operated themselves. I'm pretty sure you know many, many examples. 37 Signals, I think there are a few in Toronto here. Companies that sold later on. I'm going to touch on JBoss and MySQL if you know anything about them. So what's the secret ingredient in making your open source project successful? Obviously it's the code. Everybody talks about that more than the other aspects. But you also need infrastructure services. And maybe a generation ago, we had things like SourceForge, I think, and others. Right now we have quite a bunch of nearly free alternatives like GitHub or Bitbucket. So it's less of a problem, but you still need infrastructure services, not only for storing the code, but for other things like Sean mentioned, for collaboration like Slack or HipChat or all sorts of other alternatives. So you need a number of services to support development of your project. Then you have to think about license tracking. And Grant told us this morning how GPL is fantastic, and I wanted to have a bit of a discussion about that. But again, I don't have to do it because Sean already clarified that Apache is better.
We'll talk later.
He meant in the parking lot, I assume. You have to think about IP tracking. And speaking of GPL, there is one license. Well, I'm not talking about the flavors, GPL 2, 3, Affair, and all that. But there is one GPL license, but there are two ways in which it's used. And it's not really related to the license itself, it's related to IP. By the way, I'm not a lawyer, so don't think of this in any way as legal advice. So if you have something like Linux, where the IP is owned by a large number of distinct entities, usually people, there is no one company that can take that code and relicense it under a commercial license or anything else. Whereas there are quite a few projects that are GPL'd, some are perfect, or used to be perfect, right? Now they are Apache. Yeah, sorry about that. So where, because you own the IP, and you offer it under a GPL license, but because you own the IP, basically your competition cannot really contribute without also giving you the IP. right? So you kind of put a barrier to entry for your competitors, and because, as Sean said, companies said, we hate GPL, we cannot really use GPL, you say, not a problem, I own the IP, so I can also relicense this under a commercial license, and we're fine. And later on, you can sell your company for $300+ million if you're JBoss or MySQL to somebody like Red Hat or Oracle, respectively, right? So it's not just the license. It's also the IP management. And there are a lot of other issues. Trademark, I think it's obvious. You have to protect your trademark because if you don't enforce it, it's not protectable later on, right? Other kind of legal protection. We know of the big battle that's still ongoing between Oracle and Google regarding if APIs are patentable or not. Are you familiar with that case? So the Apache Software Foundation was an amicus party in that lawsuit, and actually I think Stefano Mazzocchi, one of the very smart Apache members that was involved in that, was actually taking the stand at some point, and we were following that online, and we kind of felt bad for him because he was under the attack of the lawyers who tried to actually protect billions of investments from their company. So it's not really a particularly nice position to be as a developer when huge financial interests come into play. So I don't know who, when they start an open source project, thinks about these issues, but they think. And obviously there is marketing. Marek, I think, told me yesterday that you should invest, what, 5 times in marketing than you invest in development? And I don't have to make the case anymore because the speaker before me was way more eloquent than I could be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Apache Software Foundation. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. It's a charity, actually. So because of that, it cannot really endorse any commercial activity, or it would lose that status. It's an all-volunteer organization, meaning that Apache does not pay for work. So all committers, contributors there are volunteers. They are not paid by Apache. It's also a community of communities. I'm going to talk more about that, in the sense that every project at Apache is governed, managed independently. The Apache Software Foundation does not really interfere with the project. It just sets some guidelines for the project so that the foundation can protect it. So the Apache Software Foundation is kind of like an umbrella entity or a legal entity that protects the projects that operate at Apache. So I'm pretty sure you don't confuse Apache Software Foundation, the foundation itself, with the license. There are many other projects that are licensed and they have nothing to do with the Apache Software Foundation. And they are licensed under the usually Apache Public License version 2. A bit of history about Apache. I think it was mentioned before. It started with HTTPD in around 1995. This was a web server, a project that was abandoned by the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, which, by the way, operated, I think, out of a university in the US, the University of Indiana at Urbana-Champaign. So I'm going to come to this later too. Universities are a fantastic ground for doing open source. The first release was in the same year, December 1st. And the issue was that the project was abandoned, but a group of people felt that it's useful. They didn't want really the code to die. And I think Glenn mentioned earlier today about his emotional attachment to a project that dies because of lack of funding, and then you have to decide, am I going to invest my time to make it work or not really? If you can. Sometimes if the IP is owned by the company, you can't even do it, right? So, and even if you can, you have to think if it's economically reasonable, it makes sense to continue working on it. So what the Apache group at the time, it was called the Apache group before incorporating as a foundation in '99, that was one of the first goals. If you have useful stuff, can we create some sort of framework so that useful pieces of code like this don't die? And the whole culture was rooted in the IETF culture that basically was talking about consensus and working code. So you don't have to come up with all the details, have a project manager, Gantt charts, and all that kind of stuff. If you have some consensus about where you want to go, you know we're going to fix the details later, just put some code together to express our ideas. Linux is the same way, right? And another critical thing, which is part of Apache core values, is that good software is produced by good, healthy, vibrant communities. So what the Apache Foundation does, it makes sure, or it tries to make sure, that the projects have a healthy community first, and then they let that community produce the code any way they want, because they know that a healthy community produces good code, and we know that by experience over the past 20 years, well, 16, 17 since it was incorporated. So where is Apache today? I didn't put the source of these slides. It's actually coming from projects.apache.org. There are a number of graphs there, more coming. So you see the first project was the HTTPD server in 1995, and then projects were added during the time. And now we are at over 300 projects if you consider those in the incubator. Top level projects, I think it's about 180 or so, is the yellow line. And some of the projects are not necessarily successful. In time, they lose interest from the people who commit there, and they kind of die, if you want. So Apache has a place called Attic. They moved to the attic, actually. That's what the red lines below the zero line mean. It means that a few projects in those months were moved to the attic, they were retired. The code is still there. Somebody at any time can take it, fork it, do whatever they want with it, but Apache, there is no Apache community around it anymore. The community actually died. The code is still there. And I'm going much slower than I planned. So the Apache way I mentioned values community over code. It has a permissive license. It's actually the only license that actually touches on patents. There is a clause, I think, the fifth clause, that says that if somebody contributes code under the Apache license, not necessarily at Apache, but under that license, it implicitly gives access to any patents that code might be infringing upon. So that you cannot really sue later on your downstream users for using a project in which you contributed code that infringes on one of your patents. Makes any sense? Very important things to think about because they may cost you later on. And another thing, it's a meritocracy. Apache is a meritocracy that basically says that whomever does the work makes the decision, right? So if you're willing to do the work, then you're right. Other people, if they contradict you, they have to do some work to prove or disprove you. I will talk more about other foundations like the Linux Foundation. At the Apache Software Foundation, actually I think it's on the next slide, the project roles. So we have users, a lot of people who use the code and you don't know of. They just take the code, they use it, they are users. They don't interact with Apache, with the community, so these are users. Well, we're not aware of them. But once you start interacting with the Apache communities, be it by asking a question on a mailing list, you instantaneously become a contributor, right? Because you contribute something to the community. And if you contribute enough, if you contribute code, not necessarily, some people contribute documentation, some people promote the projects via talks and all sorts of stuff, in time you get merit, karma, whatever communities call it, and then you can become a committer. A committer at Apache is somebody who has the right to touch the code. And if you are a committer for a while and you understand how Apache works and you understand the legal aspects of releases and how the whole release process works and the votes, I'm not sure if you're aware of that, then you become a PMC member. The PMC is the Project Management Committee. And as a member there, you can do a lot of things like vote on releases, vote on who else gets invited. But in terms of project development, they don't have more power than the developers, the committers themselves, or even just contributors. Okay, that's very important. So the PMC has to do with the community, not with the code. Committers have to do with the code. And then there is one PMC chair, which is actually, he doesn't have any extra power or anything. He's just the liaison with the board of Apache, and he has a role of VP in the foundation. So he's technically an officer of the foundation. And all these are project roles. That's how projects themselves are managed at Apache. And I have some committer stats over here. You see that we grew to about 6,000 committers almost today. You can see more on projects at apache.org. And the Apache Foundation roles, the way the foundation itself is organized, you can become a member of the foundation, sort of a stakeholder. I'm not sure how many we have right now. I think around 600-700. There is an annual meeting every year in which new members are nominated and then voted in. Members are actually, in most cases with rare exceptions, recruited or nominated from already existing committers and PMC members, people who understand the foundation. There are very few who came, they were nominated and voted in as members for contributions at the foundation level, not for contributing to projects. So there is the board. There are 9 people on the board. They get voted once a year during that member meeting by the members, who are obviously shareholders. There is a president. There are the VPs for the projects I mentioned before, the PMC chairs, and there are also VPs for operations. We have VPs for trademarks, Shane. We have VPs for press and marketing, Sally. We have a president for fundraising. And there are others. So that is how the foundation is organized. And the members, by the way, they oversee all the projects at the Apache Software Foundation. They can basically look what happens in the community. If there are any flame wars going on, there are those all the time. There are issues between vendors that use Apache projects who bend rules regarding trademarks and all sorts of things because they have to make some money as well. So that's what the members and the board are doing. And that's pretty much about governance. I want to move to talking about funding the project. And one interesting thing, I'm not sure how many noticed. Why did Sean dye his hair green? Interesting question. So there are 2 separate aspects in funding your project. One is funding the resources for your project to survive, right? It's the infrastructure to run your Git repos, run your testing if you use Jenkins or Travis or something else. Apache has its own internal services, by the way. So you need money for all this kind of stuff. And then there is the other part of funding, who's going to fund work, right? You have to think of that as well. Apache, as I said, doesn't fund work. They don't pay for contributions, but Apache does fund or does provide the resources for infrastructure and marketing and everything for the projects. And this is for the from the last annual report, and you can see that the total expenses were about, for the 300 projects we have, are about a bit under $1 million. Contrast that with the Linux Foundation that has an income of about over $30 million, right? And assets of over $20 million. So for all the work we do, I think we do it on a very decent, very small budget that any manager would laugh at. But again, we don't pay for work. So how can you fund your projects? Well, you can have donations. Usually they don't work very well in the early stages of a project, but they work a bit better once the project becomes larger. I think the most known example would probably be the Libre Foundation, maybe, that packaged the Open Office project, Apache Open Office project.
LibreOffice. It's called LibreOffice.
Thank you. But it's based on the Apache Open, yeah. Which is actually donated by Oracle, right? After they acquired Sun. Anybody knows which is the largest, I mean the latest project that was moved into the Apache incubator? Hint coming from Oracle? You don't know? NetBeans, about a month ago or 2 months ago, I lost track of time. So NetBeans is now in the Apache incubator. So as I said, donation usually come from a large number of people, small amounts, kind of like Bernie Sanders. I shouldn't go there, sorry. Campaign. But it works well, again, when you are established, people know about you, they use the product or the project and make small contributions that gets you going. Another thing that's probably the most relied upon is sponsorships. Every large foundation or project does have its own sponsors. It's done in different ways. Apache being a charity it's very different than the Linux Foundation that recognizes contributions from organizations actually. So organizations actually supply the funds to be at Linux Foundation and they nominate the people they want there. It's a different choice, a different structure. Apache, as I mentioned before, is trying to make sure that as long as there are contributions, there is a community there, the project doesn't die. The Linux Foundation for the collaborative projects, they say if there is no money for this project, it should die. Right? So who's right and wrong? Who knows? Different views. And I'm pretty sure that for some projects, one approach is better than the other. And for those who contribute or want to contribute to open source projects or start their own open source projects, there's another thing to think about. Another thing that sponsors open source projects, is grants, but at least in the US, I don't know how it is in Canada, and in the US it's a paperwork nightmare, and it's not just the paperwork itself, because you could say that, okay, that's the way it is. The problem is that there are only 2 times a year when you can get those grants approved, I think in January and in June. So you have to prepare that grant, then you have to work for it for some 9 months, then there's an evaluation period, and then you can get into a second phase and get more funds. The problem is that this grants funding process doesn't really evolve at the same pace as the industry, right? So you can't really plan. So in general, I think grants are good, but it's probably not the smartest primary means of funding.
Grants from whom?
Oh, grants from whom? Very good question.
Grants, or these are from governments? Or?
There are grants from governments, there are grants from the industry, from corporations. Those are more flexible because these you negotiate. But I was referring more to government grants, but they are not the only grants. There are grants from everywhere. But I referred mostly to government grants. European programs have their own grants as well. And there's also venture capital. And as we know, there is a big difference between the Valley and the East Coast, right? I'm sorry about the picture. So you can see, what's her name, Lori, I think. And then after that, it's your own Robert Herjavec, who's not in the picture, so I apologize for that. This is the US version of Shark Tank, right? Another option is to join a foundation, and then the foundation, depending on the foundation you choose, is going to provide some of the resources. And even this is, it can be done in multiple ways. So I mentioned ODPI before on purpose because I wanted to get to this. So ODPI is promoting actually the big data technologies and the big data space, but the actual work happens at Apache in projects like Hadoop and the ecosystem and Spark and stuff like that. But for corporations to promote the technologies, they started the ODPI project at the Linux Foundation, and both coexist actually very well. So you can come up with a business model where you actually join multiple foundations or have a mix of business models. I also want to talk a bit about the Apache Incubator, which is a special kind of project by itself, so it has its own PMC. I am a member of the Incubator PMC as well. And now and then you have some group proposing a project to join the Apache Incubator. There is sort of a standard form you have to send to the incubator. Then there is a discussion about the merits of the project. Apache wants the project to be past the initial idea phase, basically have some working code and maybe a small community, and basically prove that it has some future. And then there is a vote in the Incubator PMC, and if the vote goes, usually it does, then the project gets accepted in the incubator, where for a number of months it's gonna increase the code base. Committers put more code in, you vote in more committers, basically you grow the community, you do a few releases to figure out the release process and the legal aspects of the release process, I mean. And after, when you think as a community in the incubator that you got the idea, you know how to do it, then you basically ask the incubator to allow you to graduate. And there is another vote, and then you graduate as a top-level project, TLP if you heard that acronym, or join another project, basically merge your code base with another project at Apache that you think matches what you're doing. When projects enter incubator, by the way, usually they look for a champion, which is an Apache member that guides them through the process, and at least 3 mentors that are going to help the community during the incubation period to go through the Apache basically rules. And the last thing I want to talk about is the paid work. How do you fund your work, not for the project itself, but how can I be paid as an individual to contribute code to open source? Even here you have quite a few options. One is no funding, but in that case it's kind of like a hobby, right? You might as well go fishing. You have to have a balance in life, right? So there are people who do that because they have a need, because of believing in a cause, because of whatever reason, and they don't necessarily expect something in return. They just invest mostly some time. The problem is that, if we call it a problem, it's not necessarily sustainable for a project to rely on work that comes now and then from people who are marginally interested in the project. So for the project itself, this kind of work is probably not sufficient. What else you can do, and I think this is the case for the majority of people at Apache, is find work and be employed by a commercial organization that has some interest in that open source project. Grant, for instance, is employed by HP, right? Who is a sponsor of Apache, thank you very much. Microsoft, he mentioned, is a sponsor of Apache as well. Red Hat, I think there were talks from people from Red Hat, is a sponsor of Apache as well. So If you work for these organizations, you can, if you work a little bit harder, you can find a place, you can find an organization that would basically sponsor you, pay you a salary to work on something that you believe in. And that is also achieving some balance in life. I wanted to talk about this later, but consider this. If you work on, I'll pick on Grant again, on the Linux kernel, okay? And you work in a company, what was the company you worked for before? Okay, and they were interested in Linux, right? And you worked with a team, not by yourself. So those people contributed patches as well, did some work, some ideas that they shared with you, and all that stuff, right? And then you move somewhere else. Now the question for you is this: did you work for that company, or did that company work for you?
I would go with both.
Right? So they paid you, and they also contributed a lot in enriching you so that you can use that technology later in your career. So in my personal opinion, you have to be nuts not to work in open source. Okay. Another option, crowdfunding. There are people who did that. You can start a crowdfunding campaign. There are a few sites that allow you to do that. There are, by the way, in the US for sure, I'm not sure about Canada, investment funds that specialize in crowdfunding. So there are investment funds that are crowdfunded to invest in different opportunities. So crowdfunding was and is quite popular. That's another alternative. You can start a campaign, say, I think this feature is missing in this project. I think it would be very useful. I think I could do it over the summer, or I'm not going to be employed for 3 months or whatnot, and if I'd be funded at this level, I would implement it. There is obviously no guarantee, but it's a choice, and people do it. So something to consider. And you can also fund your coding or your contributions to an open source from other activities, like being a consultant, right? You create other kind of value or material, like I don't know, trainings or books or whatnot, and that allows you to contribute, usually at night or whatnot, to the open source project you care about. But it's funded basically not directly from being employed to work on that project. And the one that is the most interesting to me is being self-funded. If you think there is a value in the open source project you want to contribute to, then you can start the company. You can talk to other people there who you consider smart or valuable or whatnot, create some sort of a group, and start marketing it. And market and get some revenue. Profit is super important. It's what allows you to get going. Or again, go to venture capital. You have some other alternatives there as well. And actually create a product around it. Take the project and solve a problem with it, and convince people that it solves a problem, and they will pay for it. So something to be considered as well. So with that said, open source software is an experience. Join the movement. I wanted to know you better. How many contribute to open source projects? Wow. And outside the university, some other projects? Okay, fewer. I'm curious why, but well, I don't think it's the right forum to answer that. I would encourage you to take a look and find stuff that you think is valuable and really interact with people there. Most of the people are nice until they are not. But Apache, by the way, and I think somebody mentioned that before, we try very hard to encourage more women to join the open source movement, because, and we have people, I mean, who want to help. well, we know that it's a bit tricky with this male-dominated industry, but anyway, I think there is a lot of value for more contributors, especially women. So anyway, I encourage you to really try interact with more people. At least you get more ideas, and it's really enriching. So with that, thank you very much. Any questions?
I have one question regarding crowdfunding. You mentioned as a potential way to bring in money into an open source project. So with the advent of technologies like Bitcoin and blockchain and this sort of stuff, I've heard of companies or startups or projects offering what are called initial coin offerings, where they mint a token or a coin that's perhaps equivalent to some exchangeable for some service or exchangeable for like shares in this company. And I was wondering whether you could comment on those sort of technologies or developments in terms of funding open source projects.
Yes. So in any transaction, you give something, you get something. If you're happy with what you get, you're happy with the transaction. If you are happy with Bitcoins, that's fine. If something else motivates you, like, I don't know, paid trips somewhere, or I remember the Ethereum guys were at some point in a big house in Florida coding together, and somebody else paid for it. So whatever you gain in return, whatever you give, if you think it's a good transaction, then why not? The issue with that is, if you get cash to fund your work, it's very clear what you're getting. The value of cash is pretty well understood by the rest of the society, right? And whereas if you get coins, you don't know how to value. You may not know how to value that. With coins right now, it's a bit easier because you can see what the day value of the coins is. But I don't think there is a secret formula, right? If you're happy with the transaction you make, then you make it. If not, you don't. Good enough answer? Yes?
Just comment on several times you were talking about you were setting up in opposition free and open source software licensing versus commercial licensing.
Correct.
Which is sort of, I don't know the extent to which that's...
The reason I do that, I did that is to get you thinking. But what's the question?
Well, so are you deliberately saying commercial or as opposed to proprietary, since clearly there are companies who use free and open source software licensing in commercial endeavors, so they're not really in opposition quite so much. So I was just wondering if that's...
They can be in opposition. Personally, I don't really care. It's in the eye of the beholder if they are in opposition or not. My point is that you have to make a choice.
Right.
You get married, you make a choice. Is it good, is it bad? Who knows? So I think it's safer to talk about the US elections. So there is no, I mean, in the world in general, there is really no right or wrong, or maybe there is, but only future will tell. My point is that it's worth it probably to think about these aspects, be aware of them and think about them before you embark in creating a perfect thing, right? So that really was my point. And commercial, there were some other comments today about are corporations evil? Maybe, maybe not. But actually, if you really think about it, it's us who reward them for their behavior by buying. Sometimes it's the government that we don't have a choice and we pay taxes to them and they have corrupt people who reward them, but you know, hopefully we're going to get rid of these practices. But at the end of the day, if we think it's worth, again, US stuff, right? Is buying cheap stuff from China good or bad? If we think we save money to do something else good with the money that we have left, maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not, I don't know. So it's always about choices, but we cannot blame somebody without realizing that the incentive systems we create is actually what creates this monsters, not necessarily monsters. I mean, the reality that we have. Other questions? Yes.
This is really a little bit off topic, but Apache has open office, and there's a separate foundation that has LibreOffice. And it's pretty clear that LibreOffice is the one with real life, and open office is sort of hanging on. And in fact, maybe dragging down, an impediment to LibreOffice because the developers and resources are tied up there. Why, is there a method inside your foundation to kill off things that when you look from a distance seem like a mistake?
There is a method, and it's called moving it into the attic when there is no community around it. That's the only method, okay? So, but if there is no contribution anymore and nothing happens, the board is gonna say there is no point for this project to exist. So that is really the short answer to your question. I wasn't involved personally in the Apache Open Office project enough to understand the nuances and the details, but from what I know, how much code does LibreOffice have on top of Apache Open Office, percentage-wise?
Well, think of them as a fork.
But it's not a fork.
It is.
Okay, I don't know enough. It is completely fork?
It's a fork, right. A whole bunch of developers said this is crap. They resigned, took the source code, and started.
So the market will decide. From my point of view, then what's the problem?
The short answer is that the Apache Software Foundation has initiated these discussions. So there's an ongoing discussion now about retiring open office.
There is one that's true, and so I'm aware of those discussions actually because I'm the board member list actually. So that's how I know some of the details. There was a constant flame war for years between the two communities, and my understanding is that, so there is another point you're making without making it. Anybody can, because the Apache license is permissive on purpose, we say take our code, use it, make money, do whatever you want with it. We're happy, that's fine. Anybody can take any project, not just OpenOffice, Tomcat, I don't know what projects you used. Anyone, you can fork it, take it in a completely different direction. You can say that you guys started with an architecture, you're going slowly in the direction, but I think you should incorporate blockchains, you should do this kind of stuff, which means forking the project. Go ahead, do it, prove your point. That's not a problem for the Apache Software Foundation. We don't feel bad about it. We don't prevent you from doing it. I mean, if you think the idea has some merits, we even encourage you to do it. The LibreOffice versus Apache OpenOffice is a conflict of a different nature. It's personalities and a lot of stuff that it's a waste of time for developers actually, and I think Grant, you mentioned that as well.
Governance issues there too, but I'm not
Okay, so if you don't mind me chiming in here. I think this is an example of the fact that communities are hard. Communities take work. There is all kinds of history in LibreOffice, OpenOffice. It's been, that was something that started way back in the Sun days when OpenOffice was owned by Sun, and there's a lot of history there. A lot of the history and background and things that go on in communities, there ends up being a lot of things that are going on in the background that never get verbalized, and then it explodes out, and then the issue becomes about something else. So then the issue in LibreOffice, OpenOffice becomes, why is Apache wasting time with LibreOffice or OpenOffice when LibreOffice is one? And that misses the fact that there's a whole bunch of history, and that says nothing about the Apache Software Foundation. That is a reflection on what's going on within those communities. And so I quite appreciate the way the Apache Software Foundation emphasizes community. That is critically important for any project that we're involved with. And I encourage for anyone who is looking to get into an open source project or start an open source project to be thinking about the aspects of community. If you have great divisions between your developers, you're going to have a whole lot of trouble making progress, the code doesn't matter very much if you can't work together.
And you also mentioned in your keynote this morning that people sometimes are wired to hate the other Microsoft or whatnot, and things might have changed, and then you have to rewire that, and that takes a lot of effort, and some people don't even care to do it. Some new people don't even know the history, and you have parallel talks, so it takes a lot of work. It's not easy, but again, I don't know the details. I know some of what's going on. The foundation itself says that as long as there is a community and people who want to continue working on that code, by all means, we're going to support you. If you want to abandon that and do whatever, go to LibreOffice or whatnot, that's fine too. It's not a foundation issue, it's a project issue. Make sense? Any other questions?
I think we have time for one more.
Yes.
There's actually a lot of projects that have pull requests or fixes that never get released. What's the best solution in terms of that?
Fantastic question. That's why the foundation is there. If you contributed a PR and you think that those morons over there don't even look at it, appeal to one of the members or to the board and ask what's going on. I think I did work, I gained some merit, and something should happen. People are busy. It depends on the project. Some projects have people who work on it, on the project in their spare time, so they may not have time. Other projects work for other people in projects work for companies with an agenda and don't review PRs on purpose. So it depends what project you're talking about. But again, if somebody wants to contribute on Apache project, Apache is very inclusive on purpose. And if you feel that the project, the PMC actually doesn't do a good enough job, there are a lot of other ways to fix the problem. Satisfied with the answer, or you want more details? But that's a problem, by the way. It shouldn't happen. And I hope it's usually isolated incidents. I know of a few. And in ActiveMQ is one, for instance. I sent an email last week that there are 41 PRs, actually, some from last year, that nobody looked at. And JB, for instance, said, good idea, we should look at that. And I'm going to look at them as, next week as well. So it happens, but it shouldn't. And that's because, as I said, people are overwhelmed or whatever other reason. But these things, if people bring them up, they get resolved faster because you have more eyes on the problem. And usually they get fixed faster.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hadrian. So I think it's very poetic that in this first day, right, we had the day was bookended by a sort of perspective from one, let's say, end of the licensing spectrum in open source, and then sort of from the other. And thank you very much, Hadrian, for your.
Thank you.